So good evening, everyone, and welcome back. It's good to see everyone. We're holding... Oh, get the hand out. I thought you meant something. We're holding Parshas Tetzaveh. So I want to make an introduction like this. You know, we call it the 5 books of Moses, right? Even, by the way, that's not only in English. Even in Hebrew, it's called Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moses. Interesting expression why we would call it Moses' Torah, not God's Torah, but it's referred to as Moses' Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Now, the story of Moses is completely not in the first book. The first book of the Torah doesn't say anything doesn't mention his name because he wasn't born yet. He's born in the first parsha of the second sefer, of the second book, the parsha of Shemais, in the book of Shemais. And then his story continues till the end. The last book, Devarim, okay, so you have the first one he's not mentioned. The last one, it's him speaking from the beginning to end. It's a speech of Moshe. Devarim, the book of Devarim is Moshe speaking. So even sometimes you don't see his name, but it's him talking. This week's parsha, Tetzaveh, is the only parsha throughout the 3 middle books that does not have Moshe's name at all. Completely, Moshe has disappeared in this week's parsha. So it's it really stands out, and you could the Mefarshim, the commentators, ask what's happening here? Where's Moshe? So there's some interesting answers that I want to start off today's class with. The first one is, today is the 7th of Adar. Today is Moshe Rabbeinu's yahrzeit. The day of Moshe's passing is today. It's also his birthday, 120 years apart from each other. He passed away on his birthday.
So where's the Fabrengi?
Okay, right after we'll go to it. So but good question. Since we always read this week's parsha around the date of his yahrzeit, that's one of the reasons why his name is missing in this week's parsha. There's another reason why Moshe Rabbeinu's name is missing from this week's parsha. All right. How are you? Here. Another reason why Moshe's name is missing in this week's parsha is because in next week's parsha, we're going to learn the story of the Egel Hazav, the golden calf. That appears in next week's Torah portion. Now, during that episode, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, defends the Jewish people and he asks for forgiveness on their behalf. And he uses an expression like this. He says, forgive them, v'im ayin mecheni na misifracha asher kasafta. If you do not forgive them, erase my name from the book that you wrote. In other words, I don't want my name mentioned in the Torah, that in generations they're going to say that there was a man named Moses who didn't stand up for the people, didn't sacrifice himself for his people.
Isn't that kind of a chutzpah?
To tell God, erase my name from the book, is a chutzpah?
Yeah,
it is.
Telling God what to do.
I would say even more. You'd say, what's the threat? Take my name out of the book. What is that? But it's a good question. If we have a chance, maybe we'll get to it. But the fact is that's what Moshe Rabbeinu says. Now, we all know that ultimately, Hashem, God forgives the people, forgives Bnei Yisrael. So he doesn't destroy them. But nevertheless, since Moshe Rabbeinu said, erase my name from the book, so in one parsha, his name was erased. And that is this week's parsha. So this week's parsha is the parsha in which Moshe's name is erased.
Well, but right away we say, and you shall command the children of Israel. Who he's talking to?
Exactly. So it mentions Moshe by referring to him as you, and not mentioning him by name. Exactly.
All right.
There. It's 3 high. Okay, so that is the introduction to this week's parsha. Let's get into it. Oh, Tetzaveh. The Ata Tetzaveh means, and you, that's the first 2 words of this week's parsha, and you should command. It's God telling Moses, you should command Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, to continue donating. You see, remember last week we learned that the people were commanded to bring materials and to bring different substances for the building and for the use in the Mishkan. Now, in the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, there was one material that was not mentioned last week that was reserved for this week and saved for this week. And that is the material of olive oil. Pure olive oil was needed in the Mishkan to light the menorah. Every day, the menorah was lit, right? A menorah that had 7 branches, 3 on each side and 1 in the middle. It was lit every single day. enough that it should be able to last throughout the night. So that needed the most fresh and pure of olive oil. And that was the final material that we did not learn about in last week's parsha, that remains for this week's parsha. So v'ata tetzaveh, and you should command the children of Israel that they should bring to you olive oil.
Where did the olive oil come from? You got olive bushes in the desert?
No, from the north, from Lebanon. They grows olive in the north.
There's a lot of things that they obviously got from neighboring places. Last week we mentioned that they carried with them trees, right?
Trees, acacia.
Acacia trees, exactly. Perhaps they also carried olives.
But the olives, they're not going to stay.
Not going to last. That's true. It's not like trees.
So actually, the olive trees growing today, it was in Judea and Samaria. This was the olive. They grow
In Eretz Yisrael. So
Yeah.
the question now is, he's asking in the desert, where do they get it from? So, let me take a moment here to explain something that might answer a lot of these questions. But again, I'm answering now from a simple point of view without going into medrash and stories that might fill in the gaps. The pasuk says, this is later, a lot later, it says about the man, right? The manna, that the Jewish people complained that it was lechem hakol kel. They called it, basically they cursed the man because they said it absorbs into their body. In other words, there's no waste. It never came out. So everything they ate became part of their bodies. You remember that? That's exactly. It says we're going to explode from this food because everything we ate became part of us. You remember that expression? So that's an expression we're going to learn about it later. And what? They say that. Yeah, they say we feel like we're going to explode from it because everything that they're eating of the man becomes part of them. Okay? Fact number one. Fact number two is that in the book of Devarim, when Moshe is speaking to the people about going to war, at the end, actually in Bamidbar as well, they're going into wars, they're conquering lands before going into Eretz Yisrael. So it says like this, that every Jewish soldier would have to have, amongst their weapons, would have to be like a shovel, a small shovel. Why would they need a shovel? They would need a shovel because if they would use the bathroom, they should cover it. So the Mefarshim, the Gemara asks, wait a second, I thought there's no bathroom if you're eating mun. Why do you need a shovel if you're... No waste, exactly. If there's no waste, then why are you carrying a shovel?
But the wars didn't start until they conquered...
Yeah, but the wars were... No, there were wars, remember, there were wars on the way to Eretz Yisrael while there was still mun falling. Yeah, absolutely. In the final year of in the desert, of the mun coming down, they were eating, exactly, Balak, Bilam, they were eating mun and they were fighting wars. So how did those, you understand the question?
Well, because war is it's not the same thing, it's just it's a different...
No, I understand, but the food, this is the Gemara's question, that the food of the mun was absorbed into their body, so where's the waste? And the Gemara answers like this, it's true, the mun had no waste, but if they went shopping to buy from neighboring towns and buy food, that had waste.
So they may have
Understand that, Paul? So the idea is, so the Gemara acknowledges that they were going shopping for foods outside of the mun.
Didn't they drink?
They did drink water, that's true.
Well,
But that's not what they had to cover.
You don't have to bury
They
it.
didn't have to cover that. They had to cover only waste. Okay?
okay.
So my point is that a lot of times when we have these questions like how do they get olives, right? Or questions like that, how do they get this? How do they get spices? How do they get... The go-to answer from a simple point of view is that although they were in the desert, they were going around and buying things from merchants, local merchants in lands surrounding the desert. Paul, you had a question?
I think olive oil also was preserved for longer than olive, so they could have, either gotten that also brought from Egypt too.
So, but that would be interesting. That would mean that they produced olive oil before they even knew that they needed olive oil. But I guess similar to the wood.
Candle? They never lit lights
No,
in Gershon?
no.
Yeah, but they had to have enough for the Mishkan. And it had to have been squeezed for this purpose. So it's a little bit the nuts. I hear what you're saying, but I don't know if that would answer for everything. Okay,
Do you think we question too much?
it's up to you. I don't feel that.
That's a question.
I don't feel that.
Human nature, we just.
Oh, question to. Listen, here's the thing. In my life, I feel the way I answer that question for myself, there's two forms of questions. If it's questions to understand, I think it's extremely valuable. If it's questions to question, then I think it's worthless and it's really not getting us anywhere. But if the question is bringing us to understand Torah better, then we're not allowed to not question. We have an obligation to question and to ask. If it's bringing us to a point of understanding better, not just, you see, questions should not be for the sake of questions. It should be for the purpose of understanding better.
Questions are.
But
Okay.
It's much more the questions if you have a lesson one-on-one and you have 3 hours or 4 hours.
Awesome.
Or you don't have hours, let's go.
Okay, so let's go further.
Everybody's at the top of
Right.
the
So that was the beginning. The opening of the parsha again is this material of olive oil. Let's move on. Now, the majority of this week's parsha, please let's go quiet. Let's be quiet. The majority of this week's parsha, from after we learn about the olive oil until the end, is all about the garments that the Kohanim would wear. But it's introduced like this. Listen, we only know about the structure, the building of this Mishkan. We do not know who is going to work, who's going to do the service in this Mishkan. Who's going to be the one to do the service? So we all know today that the Kohanim. But the truth is, originally, you might want to say the plan was, the way it was designed to be, was that the Bechorim, the firstborn of every family, would be the one that would represent that family in doing the service in the Mishkan. So the firstborn would be the one to do the Avodah, to do the work. Now, what happened was, as I've mentioned in the past, this parsha, this mitzvah of the Mishkan really was told to us and told to Moshe after the sin of the golden calf. Right? Remember I mentioned that it's not in the right order? Not in the chronological order? So, being that the only ones that did not have any involvement in the sin of the golden calf were this tribe of Levi. The tribe of Levi, which is Moses' tribe and Aaron's tribe, they had no involvement in the sin of the golden calf. Therefore, they were the ones who replaced the firstborns and being forever the ones who would do the service in the Mishkan. Okay? So that's why it was transferred from the firstborn to now going to the Kohanim and the Levim.
Kohanim were Levi, actually. Were Levium, right?
Kohanim till today are from the tribe of Levi, yeah.
Right, okay.
So now that we know that, we start going into their clothing. Yes?
Aaron did participate, though.
When I say participate, I mean in the celebration and in donating and in serving the golden calf. I guess not willingly. He was completely forgiven for his involvement.
The Levim and the Kohanim came from the same group, so how did they determine which component was of the Kohanim?
Because the Kohanim would be Aaron and his children, and the Levim would be everyone else. Only Aaron and his children would be the Kohanim who would be doing the service. The Levim had their participation, as we're going to learn in future weeks. But Aaron and his children would be the one to actually do the service in the Mishkan. Okay, let's start picking up pace, because from this point on we start going into the dress. You see on page 2, on top of page 2, the dress, and this is really the primary focus in this week's parasha, the dress of Aaron, being the Kohen Gadol, and the dress of his children. You see, I divided it into the garments of the high priest and the garments of the ordinary priest. The number is that the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, had 8 garments. The ordinary Kohen would have 4 garments. I want to focus on some of these garments. You see, one of the ones that stand out is there was this apron that, according to most opinions, was actually a backwards apron. You know, typically you wear an apron, it goes, the front is covered and it ties in the back. In the case of the Kohen Gadol, it covers the back and ties in the front. And on the shoulders of that apron, because that apron came around on the shoulders. So on the shoulders of that apron would be 2 stones. The Torah tells us they were Shoam stones, which I understand are onyx stones. So onyx stones on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol. Each one of them would have 6 names. Which 6 names? The 6 names of the tribes of the Jewish people. So 6 on one side, 6 on the other side, you have a total of 12. Just want to say something very interesting. It was written in a way that there would be exactly 25 letters on one and exactly 25 letters on the other to show the equality and the unity amongst the Jewish people of, on these garments, all Jews were equal. As we're going to emphasize that point as we continue. Another very prominent piece of clothing for the Kohen Gadol, for the high priest only, was this breastplate that also had 12 stones, each one a different color, and each one would have inscribed on it another one of the 12 tribes. In fact, they had different colors. According to many opinions, they also had flags. Every tribe had a flag. When they traveled through the desert, they had their flag. The colors of the flags were sort of resembling the color of the stone that represented them on the breastplate. So you had like the parallel color. Another interesting thing is, talking from a very practical point of view, a lot of these stones are very, very hard. Very, very hard, like I'm talking about in terms of the, in order to engrave on them today, the way they engrave on them is by using laser. Because it's very difficult for a person to be able to carve into these stones. It is that reason that our sages tell us that they actually were not able to do it by hand, to carve out the names Reuven and Shimon. So how do they do it? Have you ever heard of the shamir worm? Worm. A shamir worm that would eat up from the stone, and that's how they used it in order to carve out the stone. Exactly. But in this case, this is the first mention of the shamir, was in order to write these names on these stones of the choshen, of the breastplate, was by using this shamir, this worm that would eat into the stone.
I read someplace the names were inside the stone, not on the stone.
You say not carved in, but inside?
Inside.
How would they be inside?
Same way the Shamir did it,
What's that?
They do now with laser.
I know now they do with laser, but
They might have had lasers then too.
Oh, yeah.
it's interesting. I have a simple question. I wonder, you see that the shamir stone, you're not leaving up the shamir, you're sort of putting it by hand. I'm not sure how this works, but you put the shamir where you want it and it does the job. I wonder if halachically laser would work because it's maybe not human effort. I don't know. Good question, you see. In the temple, would you be allowed to use laser, hypothetically speaking? Would it be considered human activity and effort to carve out the letters? Because it says it has to be done by a person.
So like you hold the water and
Apparently that's how it works. Okay, let's move along. So you have you with me? So you have the shoulder stones, the breastplate. Then you have a forehead plate. The forehead plate, there was gold forehead plate on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, of the high priest, that said on it two words. This forehead plate said, Kodesh LaHashem, which means he is consecrated, he is holy to Hashem.
Is that on the bottom of that hat?
Yeah, underneath the hat. Okay? And the hat is more like a turban with like a garment being wrapped around many times. That's what type of hat it is. Okay, another thing about this breastplate that I want to get to before I move on to the next item is this breastplate is called the Urim V'Tumim. Urim V'Tumim means that it was also, very interestingly and historically, we find this in several cases, it was used as a method of communication from Hashem to us, to the Jewish people. I'll give you an example. There were some times in Jewish history, and this only took place until the end of the destruction of the first temple, but a Jewish king who wasn't sure if they should go out to war and wanted to know if we go out to war, will we have Hashem's protection? Will we have God's protection in this war? The king, who was considered obviously a representative of the Jewish people, would stand in front of the Urim V'Tumim, would stand in front of the Kohen Gadol wearing the breastplate, and would ask his question. And the letters would light up, and the letters that would light up would communicate the answer of what they should do and what they shouldn't do.
We need that now.
Yeah.
So the next article of clothing that was, again, specific for the high priest, for the Kohen Gadol, and not for the ordinary Kohen, was what's known as the me'il. Now modern day Hebrew, me'il is a coat. But me'il is like this long dress type of clothes with no sleeves. And it had on the bottom bells. And in between the bells were like these cloth pomegranates, pomegranate-shaped things at the end. So there would be a pamoin verimoin, meaning a bell and a pomegranate, a bell and a pomegranate, and a bell and a pomegranate. That's how the bottom of this me'il, of this clothing was. And we're going to get to this idea of the bells at the end of the class, but I wanted to take a moment now to say that from a simple point of view, the reason for these bells were that the Kohen Gadol was basically asking permission. There were no doors in the Beis Hamikdash. There was no way of knocking. So his form of knocking was that when he would walk in, it would like ring a bell, as in asking permission to enter. You know, something interesting, this is a side note, but I think it will help with appreciating this idea, that for whoever here is, I know, Paul, you've been to the Ohel, right? To the Rebbe's resting place in Queens. So it's like a structure around the Rebbe's Ohel, the Rebbe's kever, right? And there's a door. So when the Rebbe would go there to visit his father-in-law, although he's going to a gravesite, he would always knock. As showing, again, taking this very idea of when you're going into a special place, you know, of course, no one's going to stop you from going in, but you want to show that, you know, this is a holy place, and I can't just feel, you know, arrogant and pride to just walk in. Knock before entering. So the Kohen Gadol would sort of knock before entering by making these noise by the bottom of his me'il. The bells on the bottom would be like the knocking, the symbolic knocking of while entering into the Kodesh HaKodashim, to the holiest place in the Beis Hamikdash and in the Mishkan. Yes.
They just found a bell not too long ago, either underneath the temple or.
Really?
Yeah.
And they think it might be from one of these clothing.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think they also found some of these diamonds. Some of these stones, not diamonds, some of these, not diamonds, onyx, right. Some of these stones were actually found there.
Wow. It's all there.
Okay. Now, after we go into the clothing, we now move along to, the Torah then goes into how Aaron and his children would be anointed with oil, as well as also the sacrifices they would bring to inaugurate them into the service of the temple. Just 1 second. In other words, up until now, we didn't learn about what the service would be, what the sacrifices would be. But the very first sacrifice we learned, which is just a one case, it didn't happen again and again, just the first time the children of Aaron were inaugurated to take this position of, you know, being in charge of the service in the temple, they brought sacrifices. And this is the first time we have this expression of reach nechoyach laHashem, that Hashem considers it a pleasant smell of the sacrifices. And our sages right away point out, say, really? Did you ever smell burnt meat? It doesn't smell pleasant. What kind of smell? What is it referred to as a pleasant smell? And they answer like this, and this is going to be a good thing to keep in mind for all the coming weeks when we mention sacrifices and we mention karbanos, is that Hashem is saying the pleasant smell is the pleasantness of knowing that I commanded and you're fulfilling my command. In other words, it's not about the smell of the meat. It's the pleasantness of the fact that we, Hashem's people, Hashem's children, are following what Hashem asks us to do. Sophie, you had a question?
Yeah, back to clothing. When I was reading in the Parsha, it was very, very interesting because it talked about the underclothing for the men, the bifurcated garment, the pants. That they had to wear some kind of linen pants under the garment itself. And in those days, nobody was wearing underwear.
That's very true. That did occur to me when preparing for today, that the Torah is very specific that those serving in the temple had to wear pants. Now that was a novelty. No one wore pants. There were robes, but no pants.
Right.
And the idea was that being that they were serving in the temple, they needed an extra measure of modesty in covering themselves. Tznius.
Yes.
So that's why they covered with pants. Exactly. Now, what's interesting is that one more thing we get to is also the carbon, the sacrifice that would be brought every single day, known as the carbon tummy. There's also mentioned this week's parsha that every single day the Kohanim would bring in the morning and in the evening. And why is this all being done? Hashem says, so I should be able to rest amongst you. you would think from that sound that we're done with speaking about the Mishkan. That from those words, why is this all being done? V'shachanti b'seich b'nei Yisrael. I want to dwell amongst the Jewish people. But what's interesting is that at the end of all this, at the end of this week's parsha, it's almost like the Torah is going now is like going like this and saying, "Oh, we forgot one more vessel. One more vessel of the temple has not yet been mentioned, and that is the Mizbeach HaKatoros, a golden altar on which incense spices were brought. That was known as the inner Mizbeach, because there was one on the outside where the animals would be brought, and the inner one. And this is mentioned and taught to us at the very end of this week's parsha. Seemingly out of order. If we have a chance, maybe I'll speak to why that's positioned in that way. Okay, so with some good timing, we covered the overview of what the parsha is about. And as we do every week, in the second segment, we like to focus on practical Jewish life, halacha that we learn in connection to the parsha.
Excuse me, Rabbi. In the picture, the men didn't wear shoes?
The men did not wear shoes. And doing the service of the temple, we know this also from Moshe Rabbeinu when Moses was first on Mount Sinai. His first time, when was the first time he went? You remember? When he was taking care of the sheep of his father-in-law of Yisrael, and he saw the burning bush. And Hashem tells him, Shal na'lecha me'al raglecha, take your shoes off from your feet. Because it's Admas Kodesh, because it's a holy place. A holy place is not fitting that a person should go with shoes. That's why even if, when Mashiach comes, when we will visit the temple, we would go without shoes.
The same thing today, when the Kohanim are different, they take off their shoes, correct?
Yeah, that is a little bit of a different reason. It could be it's connected. But what's interesting, Meir just mentioned that even till today, when a Kohen goes up to the bima, to Duchen, they take off their shoes. You ever notice that?
No, never.
Okay. Well, you're a Kohen?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. Are you familiar with why?
His father did.
Very good. I'll tell you an interesting reason why. Glenn, you ever notice that? You ever saw someone, the Kohanim will go up to Duchen, right? When it comes to holiday, they bless they take off their shoes. So this is the halachic reason. There could be it's a connection to the temple too, but the halachic reason is because if their shoelace is untied, then it'll be embarrassing. So in order to avoid any issues of a person's shoes like coming off or being, something happening, and they're going up in front of everyone, that's why they go off without shoes.
Well, wasn't there a whole ceremony of washing the feet? They had a special vessel.
Yeah, but that's not to do with the
Tabernacle.
yeah, that's exactly, that's in the Mishkan. And we're going to learn about that in next week's parsha. Okay, last week, the whole parsha was about contributing and donations, right? Donating, and our focus was about tzedakah. You remember the halachas that we learned last week were all the halachas of tzedakah. And I noticed that from the questions that were being asked was like we were only covering one side about what we should give. We were not focusing on who should take, who should we trust, who shouldn't we trust. There's actually a quote brought in from some sources in halacha. This is the quote. It says that there's a sort of a chazaka meaning that there's a good reason to suspect about a lot of people collecting that they're not doing it honestly. So do we have to give to everyone or not? So what I want to focus this week is on the gathering of funds, fundraising. And I'm doing that in connection to this week's parsha because there's a very interesting halacha about fundraising that we learn in this week's parsha. And I think it's not only applicable to fundraisers, everything we're going to learn today I think applies to all of us. So let's get started. Number one, we're going to be quoting from the Rambam on page 3 from Maimonides, who says as follows. He writes in the laws of gifts to the poor, known as the halachas of Matnas Aniyim, he says, in every city where Jews live, they are obligated to appoint faithful men of renown as trustees of a charitable fund. They should circulate among the people from Friday to Friday and take from each person what is appropriate from him to give and the assessment made upon him. So basically, every Jewish community is supposed to have what's known as a kuppah. Kuppah, now today we call it a kuppah tzedakah, a tzedakah pushka. It's supposed to be a fund that someone should be, a trustworthy person should be in charge of, that goes around collecting from people, taking from them money, in order to distribute that money to the poor of that community. They then allocate the money from Friday to Friday, giving each poor person enough food for 7 days. This is called the kuppah. Then there's another concept called the tamchoy. Kuppah and tamchoy were these two positions or two institutions that every Jewish community was expected to have. Similarly, writes the Rambam Maimonides, he writes, we appoint trustees who take bread and different types of food, fruit or money from every courtyard, from those who make a spontaneous donation and divide what was collected among the poor in the evening. Okay, so basically in addition to taking money which is assessed at how much every person is supposed to give, if someone wants to give more, or if someone says, instead of giving, in addition to giving money, I also want to give bread. I have a lot of leftover food. So you give it into this pantry type of thing, this tamchoy, and this person in charge is supposed to distribute it, giving each poor person sustenance for that day. This is called the tamchoy. The Maimonides concludes, it says, we have never seen nor heard of a Jewish community that does not have a kuppah for charity. A Jewish community that lacks a fund, an institution, where people give money and people are taking money, raising money in order to distribute to the poor, that's not a proper Jewish community. A Jewish community must have this institution. However, what?
These days we have the federation in each city. The federation does it.
A tamchoy, by contrast, whereas the soup kitchen or the pantry exists in some communities but not in others. So now basically every Jewish community is expected to have a kuppah, a monetary fund, a tamchoy, a pantry. It's better to have, but there are Jewish communities that don't have it, says the Rambam. Yes?
Every time you get a solicitation for tzedakah, you have a list of important people that sponsor these charities, which supposedly do so. So that functions as the
Kuppah, exactly. Kuppah, it would be that fund that gives out money to people in need.
So they're substantiating the veracity or the truthfulness of the solicitation, basically.
In other words, easing it on everyone else. Is that what your point is?
Well, they're verifying the honesty of that particular...
Oh, you're saying the trustees or the committee are the ones who are supposed to be in charge of checking that out. Okay, good point, but let's put that on hold to try to understand how do we trust people who are collecting money. Okay. The Gemara says like this. The Gemara in Bava Basra says, our rabbis taught, on top of page 4, the charity fund is collected by 2 people jointly and distributed by 3. A very interesting halacha, right? Because look around and you don't see this happening today. Do you see this happening today, that someone goes around collecting 2 people together? No, you always see 1 person, correct? So what's this idea? So it says in the Gemara, this seems to be the halacha, that you need 2 people in order to collect money. Why we don't see that these days, I'll get to that in a moment. It is collected by 2 because any office conferring authority over the community must be filled by at least 2 people. We do not let a position of authority amongst the Jewish people, upon the Jewish people, authority upon the Jewish people, to be filled by only 1 person. There shouldn't be 1 person that has absolute authority. It should always be shared with someone else. It must be distributed by 3 because distributing of money is similar to a court case of monetary law, which has to be done only with 3 people, not less, right? As we mentioned in the past, that all Jewish courts need 3 judges in order to make a ruling. The Gemara asks, from where is this ruling derived that you need 2 people? And Rav Nachman answers, we learn it from this week's Parsha. Because in this week's Parsha, when it says Moses appoints Aaron and his children to be the Kohanim, it says, and they shall take the gold. In Hebrew, Vehem yikhu es hazahav. Vehem is plural. So meaning, in order to gather funds, you have to be plural. So the question that we should be asking now is, how come I see people maybe knocking on my door, or people who I know who are in charge of charities, who are sort of, not that they're a one-man show, not that there's no oversight, that's not my point. My point is why they're not sharing that responsibility with others, which seems like whenever someone goes to gather money, to raise money, they have to go with someone else, because we do not give authority to 1 person alone, but only to 2. They have to share it. So what we have to explain now is, what does it mean authority? What kind of authority does the person who's gathering the money have? And once we answer that question, we're going to understand how come nowadays it doesn't apply. And it's going to come to something very practical. The Gemara asks, what authority is involved in collecting for charity? And the Gemara answers, as was stated by Rav Nachman in the name of Rabbi Bar Avua, because the collectors can take a pledge for a charity contribution, even on Erev Shabbos, even on the eve of Shabbos, when the householder may plead that he is busy preparing for Shabbos, that is the authority. In other words, like this. The one who's in charge of gathering money, let's say, for instance, I'm the fundraiser who was appointed, let's say, to be in charge of this kuppah, of this fund. I come to your house and I say, you know, Mayor, you have, this month, you're supposed to give me whatever, this amount of money. You say, I don't know, I'm busy now, I don't have it on me. According to Torah law, being the Gabbai Tzedakah, in charge of Tzedakah, I would be allowed to take an item from you as a collateral. To say, okay, listen, then give me your computer, give me your phone. Give me your phone, and when you pay your tzedakah, I'll give you back the phone. So that's what they would be allowed to do. That's why you needed two, because that is authority. The authority to be able to go into someone else's house, even on Erev Shabbos when the person is all busy and says, listen, I don't have time now, come back to me later. No, I'm taking from you a collateral that you're going to pay. That's called authority. Nowadays, no one does that. So since nowadays no one does that, we sort of abolished this idea of needing two people in order to gather funds. Because the whole idea of needing two people to gather funds it wasn't about the gathering, and it wasn't about the trustworthiness, it was about the authority to be able to sort of be a nudge. And in order the authority to be a nudge was only given to two people. Because never should there be one person who has the sole authority to be the nudge of the city. Yes, Paul?
Would the authority be authenticated by there being two witnesses?
No, it wasn't about doing two witnesses. It was that there should not be one person who could walk around saying that they have absolute authority in this place to be able to take things from other people in order to, collateral for the tzedakah. Larry, you had a question, I think.
Well, in reference to, you said it doesn't have to do with trustworthiness, but I would think, as the gentleman was saying, when you have two people, one is witnessing the other to make sure that it is a process involving integrity, and there's no temptation for sin in terms of mishandling the funds. So if you have two people...
The Gemara asks your question. I want to be clear. Larry's question is about what I'm saying. He said, why are you making it sound like the reason why you need two people is for authority? Maybe you need two people for trustworthiness. Maybe the reason why the Torah in this week's parsha says, V'heim yichu es hazahav, plural, two people should be the ones who gather the money and not one. Maybe it's about being trustworthy. You understand that? That's a very logical argument. But the Gemara asks on that. The Gemara says they have proof from different cases in Jewish history where two brothers were appointed and it was enough. The fact that two brothers were appointed means it could not be about trustworthiness, because you would not consider two brothers good enough to be, to balance each other in terms of trustworthiness. And the fact that sometimes we find in Jewish history that two brothers filled these positions teaches us that it was not about being trustworthy, but rather it was about authority. Did I answer the question? This is the Gemara's back and forth. Yes?
This is a Torah law, right?
Yes.
So how do we invalidate a Torah law?
So we don't invalidate it. We're just saying it's absolutely valid in a case when if I would go into your house to take a collateral. But since we don't do that nowadays, I don't need to. You understand? The Torah law applies in a situation where there is what's known in Hebrew as srara. Srara is authority. So long that there isn't authority, it's just me gathering money, knocking on your door, asking you for money for the pledge, whatever, then I could do it one person alone. I don't need to.
It's really a tax.
Say that again?
If it's obligatory, then it's a tax.
So it's a Jewish tax. Absolutely. The Jewish community is supposed to decide how much every person is capable of giving, and they're supposed to give that amount.
So there wasn't even an issue of trustworthiness if you had a prior commitment to pay out a certain amount on a weekly or monthly, whatever basis?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if a person felt it wasn't fair, then he would be able to probably come in front of a court, the Jewish court, and argue that position to say, they're asking of me $1,000 a month. I can't give $1,000 a month or $1,000 a week. We spoke about weekly. Weekly is more correct. And I'm not capable of giving that. But then they could probably figure out if that's true or not. But the fact is that they had a designated and set amount that every person was supposedly capable of giving, and they were expected to give that amount. And if they didn't give it, then the one going around gathering would be allowed to take a cell phone or take a laptop and say, until you pay the money, we're going to hold this.
So actually that man was called a schnorrer or a ripo man.
And actually, it was a big mitzvah. Yes?
Right, didn't we learn last week in the Torah that it was 10%?
10% is meiser. It's a little bit different. I'll tell you what, there's a few ways we could make the difference between 10% and what we're talking about now. 10% is the total amount that a person should give, let's say, in their earnings of 1 year.
Right.
But how much, we're expecting you to give every week a certain amount in order to feed the poor of the city. So you understand how, you could, let's say a person gives $100 a week and realizes that by giving $100 a week, they're actually giving 10%. So that's good enough. Then they gave their 10%. They don't have to give 10% in addition to that. Basically, I touched upon this last week, but I hope it's, I know I'm not getting all details clear, but I hope the general idea is clear, that there are two mitzvahs. There's tzedakah and there's meiser, tithing. They overlap each other because I could give tzedakah, but the amount I'm supposed to make sure I give is 10%. So if it comes the end of the year and I realize, unfortunately, it should never happen, that I did not give 10%, I have to make sure to live up to the 10% and pay up the 10%. Okay. Now, taking this one step more practical, about fundraising. The bottom of page 4, the following is a quote from Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law. A person who influences others to give tzedakah and prevails upon them receives a greater reward than the giver. Someone who motivates others to give tzedakah is considered a great mitzvah. Yeah. The managers of charitable funds and others who collect charity, regarding them it is said, and they who turn many to righteousness are like the stars.
So we brought some tzedakah money that you want to leave here.
This is very appropriate. We're learning all about tzedakah today.
There you go.
Just put it in.
Okay, we put it from the, hang on.
Lift this, thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Perfect timing. You can have like a better, like almost like I planned it. Yeah, I know. It's like. Okay, and it actually says here, the managers of charitable funds who are insulted by the poor. I guess the idea is if the poor, it could be either way. Either the poor are saying, stop taking our money, because sometimes the poor people also have to give tzedakah. So the poor are telling them, oh, why are you making us crazy, Or it could be the poor, maybe they're claiming that they need more, and then according to their estimation, they don't. I'm not sure exactly, but I think it's more about the fact that they're collecting money from the poor. They should not be upset, for this increases his merit even more. In other words, the fact that the poor are getting upset at them, why are you taking our money of tzedakah, is in a greater schus, the fact that they have to go through this hardship of people telling them off. Now let's move on to a topic that last week several people asked about. It's on the same topic of tzedakah, but a little bit of a different take, which is the laws about the receiver. In other words, the one who's receiving tzedakah also has a set of laws. And I divided it over here into 4 paragraphs. The first one is that a person should try to refrain from taking. In other words, a person should endeavor, says the Shulchan Aruch, to refrain from taking charity and endure some hardship in order not to take charity. Our sages state that it's preferable to make your Shabbos meal like a weekday rather than take from charity. In other words, even if it means making Shabbos less honorable and not honoring Shabbos completely, if you want to say, I don't want to take tzedakah, I want to live within my means, which is I can only afford a simple meal on Shabbos, nevertheless you should do it. Even if he was an honored Torah sage who became poor, he should involve himself in a profession. In other words, don't say, I'm too great to go work. I'm too much, my whole life I sat and studied Torah and I taught, this is what I was doing, and now I lost my money, so I'll rely on the tzedakah. No. Even someone in that position, it is praiseworthy, says Shulchan Aruch, and it's proper for them also to go work. Even a small profession, rather than needing help from others. And it continues and says, anyone who presses themselves to live with difficulty without taking charity, so not to burden the public, is blessed. What's the blessing? What's the blessing of someone who says, I'm within the bracket of being able to take tzedakah, but I'm not going to take. I'm going to work harder and try to make, to make it work. What is their reward? Shulchan Aruch has a beautiful reward. The blessed is blessed that one day he'll have enough money to support others. If they are refraining from taking from others, one day they're going to be successful enough to be able to give to others.
But isn't it quite interesting that there's so much stress on giving charity, while at the same time in this context it's saying that the subject of that charity should refrain from taking it if at all possible?
Exactly. It is very interesting. That from the perspective of the giver, we have to be givers. We have to give. But from the perspective of the taker, the receiver, I should say, they should try to do whatever they could to refrain from having to take. However, it's a very, very fine line. And the fine line goes like this. Someone who can't live without tzedakah. So, for example, an elderly person or a sick person or someone who is suffering, but at the same time they're too haughty and they don't take tzedakah. In other words, their pride doesn't let them take when they really, really need, is considered as a murderer and is liable for their own lives because they're basically killing themselves. They need tzedakah and they're not able to go out and work. So someone like that, you see the fine line? It's an interesting fine line we're dealing with. On one hand, the person should refrain from taking. On the other hand, if a person cannot survive without it, then God forbid, chas v'shalom, to say, okay, don't take and don't live. No. Then you must take. Very, very interesting, the balance over here is very, very specific. Yes?
If you end up not taking, would you, in a way, prevent the giver from receiving his mitzvah of giving, or does he still get the merit because he tried and then you just, it's like not being able, like you want to do a mitzvah and something happened, someone else did it, and you had the effort of trying?
I think based on what we learned last week, the answer to your question would be, you have to come up with a creative way of giving. Let's just say, tell the person you give, I'll give you a loan. Or I want to involve you in my business or something like that. And if you're creative enough, as last week we said the story of Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev, of the miser. Remember that, those who were here last week? That he found very creative ways of transferring the money to people who otherwise would never take. The ultimate matam b'seis, the ultimate hidden giving, is when the person who's taking it doesn't feel like a schnorrer, doesn't feel like a taker. Because the person who's doing it with them or giving it to them is so sensitive to their dignity that is giving it to them like a loan, but never comes to collect the loan because in their mind they gave tzedakah.
You can do it anonymously. It's the same thing.
No, he's saying if the poor person is saying, I don't want to take, I don't want to take, I don't want to take, and the person with the money is saying, please, I want to do the mitzvah of tzedakah. So I think based on what we learned in last week's class, the answer then would be to try to be a creative giver. Okay. Now, the last thing, and this is something I touched upon last week, but we did not have it inside, is as follows. A person who doesn't need to take tzedakah and nevertheless deceives people, a swindler, okay, and takes, the unfortunate ending is that person won't die before he genuinely becomes poor. In other words, there's such a fine balance we're dealing with in these halachas. On one hand, we have to be givers, so never ever to take away from that front. We have to be givers, 10%, beyond 10%, we always have to give. And in fact, we should be giving every single day whenever we could. Even the 10%, to divide it in a way that we're getting our hands used to giving. They say about the guy went fishing with his friend. Sorry if I'm not going to remember all the details, but the guy went fishing with his friend, and in the middle of the boat, tipped, and one of the guys fell over. So he started yelling at him. He says, "Give me your hand, give me your hand." And after a while, the person didn't know how to swim, and he drowned. After the levaya, it's not a true story. After the levaya, the wife of the man who drowned came to him and said, "What happened? Did you try to help him?" He said, "Yes. You know how many times I was yelling at him? I was yelling at him. I was saying, 'Give me your hand, give me your hand.'" She said, "Oh, you should have said, 'Take my hand.' The man never gave anybody." Okay, never gave anything to anybody. You heard that one? Or no?
No.
Okay, the idea was that, but,
There's a difference between giving and taking.
exactly. So he's saying you should have said, take my hand, not say give. He would never give his hand. So what we have, and it's sort of like a series that we have between last week's parsha and this week's parsha, and last week's class and this week's class, is that last week we focused as much as possible on the obligation to give. And that's what I hope we all left last week with clarity in that front. Now in this week, the clarity is on the number one, the obligation of every Jewish community to have a fund and a fundraiser to gather the money, to distribute the money, as well as food. But also, we went into the nuances, I think that's the right way to put it, of the one who's on the receiving end. They should try to avoid taking, but not to the extreme that puts them in danger, not to the extent that it puts them in danger. And obviously, a person who doesn't need should not be collecting. So that is sort of the full package of the mitzvah of tzedakah as it appears in Shulchan Aruch. Okay, now let's move on to the third segment, which, as we've been doing in the past few months, are stories of Hasidim that bring out one of the messages in this week's parsha. You know, one of the clothing that was equal both to the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, as well as the ordinary priest, was a sash, like a avnet. The avnet is like a gartel. It's thicker than this, but they would, wrap themselves like a belt around their waist, a few times around with this very long cloth. And our sages tell us that the reason for this is, like every garment was there to sort of atone for the Jewish people in a particular area, it was there to atone for thoughts that come from our hearts. In other words, improper and thoughts that we shouldn't have that are coming from our hearts. The reason why they wore this gartel, this sash, this avnet, was to atone for the people's thoughts. On that note, I would like to share a story, a beautiful story about controlling our mind and controlling our thoughts. This story happened with the Maggid of Mizrich. In case you're wondering in terms of context, I wrote down the date that he passed away, or the year that he passed away. But he was the teacher of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev that we learned about last week. So the Maggid of Mizrich had a student who came to him one time and said, Rebbe, I don't understand. I understand when you give me a mitzvah, I'm able to do a mitzvah. You tell me put on tefillin, you tell me pray, I could do all these mitzvahs. Tzedakah, I'll give tzedakah. But how does the Torah give us a mitzvah to control our mind not to think improper thoughts? How are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to have control over thoughts that come into our mind without any, we don't have control over that. They just come into our mind. They sort of like shoot up into our mind from our heart. So the Maggid told him, you know something, go to my student, Zev in Zhytomyr. Zhytomyr is a city in Ukraine. Go to Zev of Zhytomyr. What's that?
Yeah, still is.
Still is, yeah. Let's go to Zev in Zhytomyr and he'll answer your question. So he travels to Zhytomyr. He comes to Zhytomyr. His long travel is very cold. It was a winter, season in Russia, very, very cold. And he comes, it's late at night. And he comes to Zev's home. It's the only home that there's a light still, a candle still burning at night, because Zev was someone who would study Torah the whole night. So he knocks on the door. Shash still, nobody answering. So he knocks again. Nobody answering. He peeks into the window and he sees Zev sitting there at the table, just a few feet away from the door. So he knocks louder. Garnished. Nothing. He's yelling. He says, what kind of house is this? That leaves a Jewish man in the snow. Nothing. Quiet. After hours of standing there near the door, it started to get a little bit light outside. Zev gets up, opens the door, welcomes him in very warmly. He says, oh, come inside. I'll give you a good bed, something to eat, something to drink. Very mysterious. This man is treating me very nicely. But how did he ignore me? For a good few hours, keep me in the snow. Oh, a real chutzpah. What kind of sensitivity is that to another person? What kind, it takes a real cold person to leave someone in the cold. So he waits basically he spends a few days together with Zev Tamer, and before he goes back home, he says, I should really ask him my question, which is the purpose why I'm here. He turns to Zev, he says, Zev, or Reb Zev, I'm really here with a mission. Our teacher, the Maggid of Mizrich, sent me here to try to figure out how does a person have control over thoughts that spontaneously come into their minds. Zev said, well, I answered that question. He said, how did you answer that question? He says, from the very first moment you came to this city, I answered that question. You see, I'm the owner of this house. And I'm going to decide who comes in and who doesn't. And I'm the owner of my mind. And not every thought that knocks on my door of my mind am I going to invite in. In other words, the reason why he left him outside was to teach him a lesson much more powerful than just that night. A lesson that would live for him for the rest of his life and for us, which is sometimes we have thoughts and they come into our minds. The question is, are we going to open the door and say, take a seat? Or are we going to say, listen, this is my mind, it's my thoughts, it's knocking very loud, but I'm not going to invite these thoughts in. I'm not going to continue dwelling on these thoughts. That was the message he taught him. He taught him that, we sort of don't think of thought as an action. When it comes to an action, you could do something, you could stop doing it. What he was teaching him is that thoughts as well, when thoughts come into our mind, we have control to say, I don't want to invite this in. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say, sinful thoughts, if it doesn't translate into action, then you're actually, in fact, controlling your Yetzer Hara, so it's actually a credit towards you. Because you're actually exercising mastery of the thoughts by not letting the thoughts convert into action.
But we also, that's my point. The actual act of thinking, of letting that thought dwell in our mind, is an action. Do you understand what I just said? It's for those who, the letting a thought sit in our mind is an action. We usually don't think of it that way, but contemplating on something and let it sit in our mind is just like...
But doesn't Judaism base a sin on the action as opposed to the thought?
But the definition of action... No, good question. But the definition of action in Judaism is thought, speech, and action. In other words, the fact that a thought knocks on my head is not my fault. In other words, the fact that my heart wants me to think about something, that's not something that I'll have control over. But what I do have control is if I'm going to open the door and give it a seat and sit down and make yourself comfortable. So a thought comes into our mind, it's now up to us to let it sit outside or to invite it in. That was the message that Zev was teaching him. It is a fundamental... What are you making it sound?
I don't like the lesson.
Why not?
Because it's ridiculous. It's winter time. It's cold. It's snowing. It's below zero. It's not. You don't do that to people.
Don, I'll tell you the truth. Good point. But I'll tell you, some people... What? It's a story that actually happened. But even if your point is right, I want to say it like this. To master a person's thought is more valuable than even... it's worth the investment of staying a few hours in the cold. For him to be able to... What's that?
Maybe it was not so cold.
Maybe it wasn't so cold. Maybe it wasn't... But then
it's not so cold. Somebody's knocking. You don't have to...
But there's an opposite story, too, about one of the Rabbis. His child fell out of the crib and was crying. And he's learning Talmud and everything. And his father has to go tell him, you heard a child crying? That's more important than what you're learning in Talmud.
Yeah, but
the same kind of principle.
In this case, he wasn't trying to teach the child a lesson. In the case of our story, what he's trying to do is teach this man who came and traveled all the way because he felt what's bothering him more than anything else. You know what was bothering more than anything else? Wasn't the cold, wasn't the heat. What was really bothering him was the fact that he wants to finally have control over his thoughts. That was his ambition. That's what was bothering him more than anything else. With this lesson, it worked. And it wasn't a punishment. It was a way of illustrating how just like in our own homes, we decide who we let in, and if someone could knock, that's not a reason to invite them. If someone is knocking, if we don't want that individual to come into the house, we don't have to let them in just because they're knocking. That's what his point is. In our thoughts, the same process applies. And the same idea applies. What was that, Moshe? I thought you said something. Boundaries. Yeah, but if I could, I want to focus on, and I'm trying to make one point. I'm trying to make this crystal clear so we don't, lose the message. The message over here is that mastering our thoughts is something that is within our reach. How is it within our reach? By recognizing that we do not have control over the first thought, but we have control over the second thought. You understand? We don't have control over the first time it comes into our head, but we do have control over the next second if it's going to stay there or not.
You can make a mental equation that a particular thought is destructive towards you. That may allow you to exercise greater self-control. But you have to make that equation.
Well, you're saying you first have to decide and recognize that it's not for you. Yeah, first you have to decide who you want in your mind, and then you could decide who to open the door to. I always found this story to be a very motivating story, a very powerful story in my own life, by recognizing that we should realize that our minds are not spontaneous. And yes, spontaneously maybe something comes in, but it's now our choice to decide what's going to be the next moment. Yes, Moshe?
How does this relate to the parsha?
I said because the sash was atoning for the thoughts of the heart.
Is that like, is that the same type of sash
Yeah.
you had?
Because it makes a definition, a boundary between your
Exactly. And the lower parts of your body. Correct. Okay. It's 8:30, but I do want to conclude with the last point. The last point I call the bells. They say a story of an individual, a wealthy man who invited a beggar into his house. He invited the beggar into his house for a meal, and then the butler starts serving the meal, and the wealthy man takes his plate and very calm takes a spoon of soup or a spoonful of soup or a piece of meat, whatever he's eating. With this beggar, on the other hand, all you hear on the table is clink, clink, clink. He's eating very quickly, like really enjoying the food. The cook turns to the butler and says, "You know something? Finally, someone who appreciates my food." He said, "Finally, someone who has a good palate to fine cuisine, to understand good food. The wealthy man, every single day I make him food, and he eats it, indifferent, as if like it's nothing. This guy understands what good food is." Now, the butler turns to him and says, "It's actually quite the opposite. Noise," and this is where the point I want to make, noise and comes from distance. When something is far, the reason why you hear the noise of fire when it burns wood is because there's resistance. The resistance is what makes noise. In the case of the poor man, it's that it's so far, it's so foreign to his lifestyle, this good food, that's where the noise is coming from. Whereas the tranquility of the wealthy man is that, he enjoys it. He's really sort of, you want to say, in the level of having this food, and he has it every single day. And that's why he's not going crazy about it, because it's sort of who he is. It's not something that he's struggling to reach. Why am I getting to that? Why am I mentioning this? Because the idea of the bells on the bottom of the Kohen Gadol's me'il, of the Kohen Gadol's garments, represents a noisy Jew. Who's a noisy Jew? In many ways, we are all noisy Jews. A noisy Jew means someone who has resistance in their life. In other words, a tzaddik is smooth sailing. A righteous person is smooth sailing, right? There's no resistance. There's no struggle. The noise of the bells represent our struggle. The Baal Shem Tov was one time asked, how come him and his students sing during davening, make a lot of noise during davening, sometimes daven loud? And you know what he answered? He said, "Did you ever see someone drowning?" He said, "Yes, they're yelling and they're making a lot of noise with their hands because that's what a person feels like. A person feels that they're sort of removed from where they want to be, and that the noise represents that struggle." The Kohen Gadol, when entering into the Beis HaMikdash, had to represent every single Jew. Not only the most righteous of the Jews, but even those who are on the bottom end of this garment, representing the bottom end of the spiritual chain, who their life is full of noise. What type of noise? This struggle and friction between the life, that we're being pulled to one side, pulled to the other side. When the Kohen Gadol would go into the Beis HaMikdash, he went in with everyone, including also the Jew with the struggle. And the noise is representing them. So what we did today is 4 segments. We did all 4 today. Number 1, we had an overview of the Parsha, which really, in short, is all about the clothing of the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen. In the beginning of the Parsha, we learned about olive oil. In the end of the Parsha, we learned about the golden altar, but that's generally about Aaron and his children becoming Kohanim and what they would wear. The second segment, we learned the halachas, the laws about fundraising, and how every Jewish community needed a fundraiser. The third segment, we shared a story of Zev of Zitamer about having control over our thoughts. And we connected it to the Parsha with the sash representing a person's thoughts, atoning for a person's wrong thoughts. And the fourth segment, we have now a deeper understanding of what these bells mean in our lives. They represent the struggle that sometimes we all feel in getting close to Hashem. And when the Kohen Gadol would go in to do his avodah, to do his service, he represented every single one of us, even when we're going through the most difficult struggle and being the most noisy. I want to say thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And Mitzvah Hashem, next week, we should come see each other again in gesund, in good health, and only for happy and for good occasions. Hi, gesund, Larry. Good seeing you.